So the big question is, are the Philistines that we read about in the Bible and the people living in Palestine today the same people? And the short answer is no, they are not. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time. Thank you. Bye bye. Right, now let's take a deeper dive into the the connection between the Philistines that we read about in the Bible and the people living in Palestine today. The answer is still that they're not the same people, but there is a connection. Well, kind of. Let's start at the beginning. So, obviously, we first have to ask the question, who were the Philistines? So the Philistines were sea people, Greek island inhabitants. They used to live on some of the Greek islands, and then they decided to move and go and settle somewhere else. So they got onto their ships and took sail, and they were known as the Vikings of the Mediterranean Sea. So, and that they truly were, in a certain sense, almost I want to say pirates. They were invaders who robbed and plundered as far as they went. And maybe it's ironic, but the word Philistine literally means invader. So they sailed in their ships looking for a place to settle, and eventually, and originally they started near the coast of Egypt, but the Egyptians forced them northwards, and then they went up higher, and eventually they settled in the part that the Bible calls Canaan, and along the coast, especially between the cities of Ekron and Gaza. And there was always, in the time of the Bible, war between Israel and the Philistines. Um, for example, just to give a few examples, Samson, he killed a lot of Philistines, and at the end of his life, he also killed a lot of Philistines and Philistine princes at the festival for their god Dagon. That was after he was eventually seduced by Delilah. That was, of course, also a Philistine. Later on in the Bible, David kills Goliath of Gath, and that was, of course, Goliath was also a Philistine, and Gath was a Philistine city. And a bit later, King Saul was killed when the Israelites was busy fighting or were busy fighting the Philistines. So it was a constant battle between Israel on the one side and the Philistines on the other side. They were enemies. And the Philistines were settled, like I said, at the coast. And that, of course, in the bigger picture, made trade for Israel more difficult because they had to go through the Philistines to get to the coast to sail with ships and to trade with the Greek islands and the rest of the world. And the Philistines wanted to conquer land inwards towards Israel, and of course Israel had to push them back to the sea. So again, the question is, uh, are they today's Palestinians? And the answer is no, like I already said. But let's take still a deeper dive. So the Philistines, it's important to know that they were totally destroyed. First by King David in Old Testament times, but later um, in the totality under Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And this meant that the Philistines ceased to exist as a people. But the important thing, and here's where the connection comes in, is that the places they founded and the names they gave to the places, those names were kept. And later, the region where the Philistines lived came to be known as Philistia, and from there today's uh, Palestinia. So that's the connection. So that was Philistia was literally the geographical area, not because it was a kingdom or because it was ruled by the Philistines necessarily, but because they lived there. And from Philistia, like I said, then later developed Palestine. Some historians say that the Romans, after conquering Jerusalem, deliberately named the region Philistia after they won the battle against the Jews, because they knew that this piece of land was very near to the hearts of the Jews, and that's why when they defeated the Jews, they named this piece of land Philistia to mock the Jews. And they what they did is they named this piece of land after the arch enemies of the Jews. So what's also important for us to know is that the word Palestinians or Palestine does not exist. There is no such place or such people. But today, the Palestinians are those who come from everywhere. They come from Lebanon, from Syria, from Jordan, and from Arabia, etc. There is no language, no race, no culture, no national animal, or anything of the kind. Today, some people do consider themselves Palestinians and want to be called Palestinians, but it's also not a specific place that you will find on the world map or even on Google Maps, for example. It's just that piece of land that exists and that is referred to as Palestine. And if people want to be known as Palestinians, then it's their full right, I would say. But so the only connection between the Palestinians and the Philistines is that the Palestinians are now today the enemies of Israel, and the Philistines of the Old Testament were also the enemies of Israel. And this is the only similarity, ironical similarity between the Philistines of the Old Testament and the Palestinians of today. So let's dive deeper into the history of Palestine. So Palestine sits on the crossroads between Asia and Africa. It's the piece of land that connects Africa to the Middle East, to Europe, and to Asia. So as a result, one can only understand that is why it's such an important area that everybody wants to own or be in control of, especially before the age of aeroplanes. You can think to yourself that it was even more important for trading purposes to be in control of this piece of land. And it's the only route that could be followed by the caravans, the trading caravans from Africa and Egypt to the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and further on. But so the question is still, where exactly is Palestine located? So this piece of land called Palestine is located mainly between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. This was the case um, especially since 1918 with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And from there on, there has been small moves and shifts, and some places stayed part of Palestine and others not. So today's Palestine is located in the West Bank, an area between the modern Israel and Jordan and the Gaza Strip, which is the border between Israel and Egypt, of course. And the Bible, of course, like I said, mentions that King David and both the kingdoms after him of the later Israel and Judah resided in this area. But it's also important to know that over the years, many empires, such as the empires of the Babylonians, later the Greeks, and following them the Romans, ruled over this area. Then, bit later in history, after the New Testament times, in about 637 uh, after Christ, about or less than 5 years after Prophet Muhammad of the Muslims' death, with the fall of Jerusalem to the Muslims, it was under Muslim rule for a long period from 637 and onwards. But in uh, the time period following that, there was the Christian Crusades, of course, and the Christian armies from Western Europe fought to recontrol, especially some of the holy places for Christians inside this area called Palestine. So, but however, the Muslims remained largely in control of this area. And then a lot further on in history, um, in 1517, under the great Ottoman Empire that I already mentioned, the Muslims from Turkey were in control, and they resided in the area up until 1917 during the outbreak of the First World War and after. So after the First World War, or during the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was defeated, and after World War One, Britain took control of Palestine. And the League of Nations gave Britain a mandate to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which took effect from 1923. Then, some years later, in 1947, the UN, or the United Nations, or gave a mandate that the area of Palestine should be divided into two. On the one side, an independent Jewish state, and on the other side, an independent Arab state. And this was known as the partition plan. And the big fighting point, I almost want to say, was about Jerusalem. And Jerusalem would then belong to both parties, but also not to one of them, and would become an international territory with a special status. And of course, the Arabs, the Muslims, did not like that at all. But then a bit later, the next year in May 1948, Britain withdrew all its forces from Israel and from the area, and Israel declared itself an independent state. And it's important to note that this happening showed Israel's readiness and willingness for this partition plan. So it was kind of the normal thing to happen. This was the plan that was laid out. So it was normal for Britain to withdraw, for Israel to say, okay, now we are a state and we are claiming the part that is given to us. But when that happened, immediately the neighboring Arab nations sent their armies, and they moved in to prevent the establishment of the state of Israel. Of course, they failed, and Israel was established as a state. But the result, the result was, of course, the 1948 Israeli-Arab War, and it was a war, of course, between Israel and five Arab nations, namely Transjordan, today's Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. And at the end of the war in 1949, Israel was in control of two-thirds of the original British mandate, while Jordan was in control of the West Bank and Egypt was in control of the Gaza Strip. Then, some years later, in 1964, the PLO, or Palestine Liberation Organization, was founded with the main goal of destroying the state of Israel and thereby establishing the state of Palestine. So a few years later, about 4 or 5 years later, in 1969. Yasser Arafat became the leader of the movement until his death in 2004. But back to 1967. In 1967, uh, a build-up of political friction between Israel and its neighbors led to a severe air and artillery strike and battles between Israel and especially Syria, during which six Syrian fighter jets were destroyed in April of that year. And in the wake of this battle, the Soviet Union gave Egypt information that Israel were moving troops into the northern border near Syria, and that Syria was preparing for a full scale invasion. And this was not accurate information, but this information drove Egypt to send its troops to the Sinai Peninsula, where the UN peacekeeping troops had been guarding the border for over a decade. And of course, but this caused the Egyptian troops to drive out the UN. And what followed was on the 5th of June 1967, when Israel heard about this news, they thought that they had to defend themselves, and they launched a full-scale airstrike against the troops of Egypt. So then Jordan and Syria sided with Egypt and tried to aid Egypt and help them. But in short, the war that lasted for 6 days, and therefore it's known as the Six-Day War, was won by Israel. And at the end of the war, the result was that Israel conquered large parts and was now in control of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and also the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. And of course, I almost want to say it's logical to make the assumption, and that's of course what happened, that the result was constant conflict between Israel and its neighbors. Then some years later, in 1978, there was the Camp David Accords. And at the Camp David Accords, there were more permanent peace treaties that was put in place and was established between Israel and Egypt. And Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And there were also further negotiations to get Palestine more independence in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and more autonomy. And then what followed was plus minus 10, 11 years later, in 1987, the first intifada break out. And this was because the Palestinians were angry, because they said that there are still Israelis that are residing and living in Gaza and the West Bank. And the Palestinians believed that this piece of land now belongs to them. And as a result, the Palestinian militant groups rose up, and hundreds of people were killed. The result was then that followed was the so-called Oslo Peace Accords. So Oslo is in Norway. It's of course the capital of Norway, and that's where these negotiations took place in 1993. So during this Oslo Accords, a timetable was set in place and drawn up for peace in the Middle East, and an interim Palestinian government came to rise in parts of Gaza and also in the West Bank. And this agreement was signed in 1993 between Israel's Prime Minister, uh, Yitzhak Rabin, who was later assassinated by Yigal Amir, an extremist on the other side, and of course the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat on the other side of this peace treaty. And that was exactly the the point of explosion, because the Palestinians thought that the Israelis took too long to move out of Palestine, and The Israelis said, "We've lived here since forever, and you need to give us time to relocate." So that was what the Oslo Accords, in a big sense, tried to establish. Then, some years later, 2 years later, in 1995, there was also a second Oslo Treaty, which tried to achieve the total withdrawal of Israel's troops and the IDF, or the Israeli Defense Force, from the West Bank. But in the end, the Oslo peace treaties, in which many countries, including uh, America, and at that stage Bill Clinton was the president, were involved, were not a success and did not and could not bring Israel and the Palestinians to a complete and final agreement of peace. Then, a few years later, in September of 2000, the second Intifada broke out when a Jew by the name of Ariel Sharon, who would later become one of Israel's prime ministers, visited a Muslim mosque. And this drove the Palestinian Muslims to riot. There was an uprising, suicide bombers or bombings followed, and all of this caused this period of reasonable peace between Israel and Palestine, and all of the previous peace treaties to be completely broken. All promises and peace treaties went down the drain. And what followed was a time of violence between Israel and the Palestinians. This continued for almost 5 years. And then in November of 2004, like already mentioned, Yasser Arafat died. And in August of 2005, the Israeli army completely withdrew from Gaza. Then in 2006, a new devil came to the forefront, namely Hamas. Just to give some background, Hamas literally means violence. It's a Hebrew or Aramaic word, and it means violence. And it's the same violence or Hamas that was used in the Bible when Abraham chased Hagar away, because Ishmael, the father of the Islamites of today and today's Islam movement, that says that the promised land is their property because Ishmael is the illegitimate heir of Abraham, used this Hamas or violence against baby Isaac, the rightful heir. And that is why Abraham chased away Hagar and her son Ishmael. But to come back to Hamas, Hamas is a Muslim militant group that won the Palestinian legislative election in 2006. And in the same year, fighting broke out between Hamas and Fatah. Fatah was the group that was now in control of the PLO after Yasser Arafat died. And in 2007, Hamas defeats Fatah and takes total control of Gaza. Since then, there has been a constant war between Israel and Hamas, with Hamas launching missiles, airstrikes, suicide bombers, terrorist attacks, etc., every now and then on a regular basis against Israel and even the common innocent man on the street of Israel. In 2014, Hamas and Fatah reunited and decided on a unified Palestinian national government. But constant power struggles between these two parties eventually caused a final dissolution or split between them in 2019, which resulted in Fatah being dominant in the West Bank and Hamas were in full control of the Gaza Strip. Then in May of 2017, Hamas presented a new charter to Israel in which they proposed that the original 1967 borders for Israel should be kept, but they wanted Jerusalem as the capital for themselves, and they also refused to recognize Israel as a state. And as a result, of course, Israel totally rejected it. Then in May of 2018, tensions rose again when the US embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the Palestinians, of course, saw this as an American or America's support of Jerusalem becoming the capital of Israel. And of course, they reacted, and this led to uprisings and protests, marches in which the IDF or the Israeli Defense Force responded with force and where protesters were killed. Then, a bit closer to home, about a year or so ago, a bit more than a year ago, on October the 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a coordinated terrorist attack on Israel where they shot missiles and rockets at Israel, where they broke through the border and killed a lot of people. Normal people on their way to a police station were killed, where they killed 10 policemen as well. And they also killed and took captive a lot of people at the music festival and also at some of the kibbutzes. And in total, more than 1,000 Israelis were killed and 200 were captured. The result, of course, was that Israel's now Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared, "We are at war." Israel responded with counterattacks and counter airstrikes against Gaza, where thousands of Palestinians died. Furthermore, it's important to keep in mind that while all of this is going on between Israel and Hamas, there's another enemy called Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is in Lebanon and attacks Israel from out of Lebanon. Hezbollah already destroyed Lebanon and they want to destroy Israel as well. It's also important to note that Hezbollah is especially subsidized to buy their missiles and rockets by Iran, that also wants Israel to be wiped, of course, off the face of the earth. And then in the past year, Israel decided to really retaliate and started fighting back. And I want to end off this conversation just to give some facts about what happened since the start of 2024. So, firstly, in January of 2024, Saleh al Arauri, one of Hamas's leaders and founders, was killed in Beirut, in Lebanon, during an airstrike. And following in his tracks, other Hamas leaders like Marwan Issa, Muhammad Deif also followed. On July the 30th, Faoud Shakur was also killed during an airstrike, and he was a founder and leader of Hezbollah. Then the very next day, Ismail Haniyeh, another Hamas leader, was killed when a bomb exploded in his hotel room. In September, Hassan Nasrallah, who was the leader of Hezbollah for more than 40 years, was killed by Israel in Hezbollah during a skirmish in the underground Hezbollah tunnels in Beirut. And just a few days ago, on the 17th of October, Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader and the mastermind behind the October 7, 2023 terrorist attacks on Israel, was killed also by Israeli defense forces. In conclusion, it must be said that the average citizen of Israel and of Palestine just wants peace and will most likely live in peace with each other. But the problem is that the Muslim extremist groups keep attacking Israel And Israel has now decided to not just defend itself, but to eliminate the enemy before the enemy can strike again. And although it's a constant war and politics and war and stuff is going on constantly in the Middle East, it does kind of look like Israel is now making progress. But there has been war over this piece of land called Palestine for almost all time since the beginning of time. And there will probably be war over this piece of land called Palestine until the second coming of Christ.